Okay. Hello, everyone. This and that, 26 September. We're on Hudson 14, Michael Hudson's book, you know, Killing the Hosts. And I put in some things like this front end here. I won't read. It's a review of a book talking about the role of Citigroup. And Citigroup, needless to say, if you've been following the story, it appears that Bank of America and Citigroup got away with whatever they part of the problem of the 2008 crisis. We're going to look a little bit more at that today, but I think today we'll concretize the critique of President Barack Obama's being sort of a stooge of Wall Street, and it's sort of unfortunate. I mean, truly, it is unfortunate, but you could see what he was trying to do. That is to try and fix the economy without doing anything horribly radical, which meant essentially that he capitulated to a certain set of elites like Larry Summers and a bunch of those other, oligarchs, bank oligarchs. So it's unfortunate on the one hand. On the other hand, he did save the economy. It didn't go all to hell, and so I suppose that's a good thing. On the other hand, capitalism still flounders around. And I included a little thing because it's not mentioned, and maybe it will get mentioned by Hudson, parallel to all this. And he mentions it in a side sort of comment about mergers and acquisitions. Mergers and acquisitions are also part of this same oligarchic process. And as I mentioned before, in the loss of the Pac-12 athletic conference, it is like a merger and acquisition. Essentially, they, turned the Pac-12 into a toxic asset and essentially picked it clean, so that UCLA and USC are now in the Big Ten, and Stanford and Cal are in the ACC, and Colorado and Utah, well, at least Colorado has returned to the Big 12. So whatever, I'm doing my little Cameron deal there. Okay, so I included that. At the end today, I'm going to put in an interesting thing. One person decided that they would have Chat GPT write an obituary of Frederick Jameson, which was really interesting. I mean, it sort of makes sense, but doesn't really. And then our friend Zavov Zizek wrote a little appreciation of Fred Jameson's actually quite good. It's really because Zizek actually, writes in a non-wild way when he really cares about something. And you can see that he cared about the way he wrote this thing. So it was very, I find it very interesting. You may not like Zizek and you may not like Jameson, but it's interesting how appreciative he was. I mean, it showed that he really read every damn thing that Jameson wrote, which is also equally more fascinating. All right, chapter 14. The giveaways get more deeply politicized and corrupt. Tim Geithner, serious bad person from the crisis. There's this thing about hindsight and stuff. Many things that seemed prudent at the time turned out to be imprudent. Geithner testifying at the 2014 AIG trial against the U.S. government. AIG reflects non-American money within the context of this problem. It sounds as if everything was just an accident, like the chronic IMF and European Central Bank miscalculations that austerity will bring recovery and prosperity if bondholders are paid enough, social programs and pensions cut back enough, and wages lowered enough to restore confidence. The same mistake is made decade after decade. The post-2008 giveaway to Wall Street without benefiting strapped mortgage debtors was no accidental mistake. It was deliberate policy over which politicians shed crocodile tears when it turned out that the public lost heavily while the wealthy 1% serving institutions gained so vastly. Yet this benefit for insiders and the 1% is what made the bailout a successful policy capture from Wall Street's vantage point. Oh, we didn't do it for the banks, claimed Geithner. We did it to protect people from the failures of banks. It's very counterintuitive. Well, indeed it was. It was the FDIC's job, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC's job to protect depositors against failure. And Geithner worked like a demon to block the commission from performing this function by taking over the large and most reckless banks that he was protecting. This rationale that saving the people required saving the banks, the trickle-down idea that saving the 99% required enriching the 1% even more, became the umbrella for unlimited giveaways and concessions to the Treasuries and Fed's Wall Street constituency, much as bondholders used to hide behind widows and orphans whose trust funds presumably would be eroded by inflation, resulting from wage increases for the population having to work for a living. President-elect Obama's refusal to help over-indebted homeowners. Yeah, this is actually a question you need to sort of think about. Which side was he on in that context? Barney Frank, Democratic chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, wanted banks to use some of the bailout money to scale down mortgage debts to payable levels. Homeowners would have received the benefit, and their mortgages would not have gone bad. Paulson at first resisted that. He just wanted to get the money out, Frank said. But after he got the first chunk of money out, he would have had to ask for a second chunk, he said. All right, I'll tell you what, I'll ask for that second chunk, and I'll use some of it as leverage on mortgages. But I'm not going to do that unless Obama asks for it. But Obama, the president-elect, rejected the proposal. This is now December, right? December 2008. So we tried to get the Obama people to ask him, and then they wouldn't do it. During the critical period when the TARP was being administered, there was a vacuum of political leadership. And Obama, at one point, when we were pressing him, said, well, we only have one president at a time. This is his way of saying no. The problem was not so much a vacuum of leadership as one of continuity from the Clinton and Bush administrations. This is that whole point. It's all neoliberal in that context. Obama quickly locked in the giveaways on pro-bank terms by naming Larry Summers, he of Harvard, etc., as his chief advisor and promoting Geithner to take Paulson's place as Treasury Secretary. Summers and Geithner were in place to block moves that would not serve the Rubinomics wing that had risen to dominate the Democratic Party. Robert Rubin, after all, had been Obama's major early sponsor. Obama's refusal to press for debt write-downs or back any other conditions for the TARP left Democrats owning the bailout. They supported it without conditionalities. The government did not even use its majority ownership in Citigroup and other too-big-to-fail banks to fire the officers responsible for bank losses. No civil and criminal charges were brought against personal malefactors in the troubled institutions. In contrast to Britain's government forcing top executives to resign at RBS, Northern Rock, and Bradford and Bingley, neither the U.S. Treasury nor Congress asked for any say in the running of these rogue institutions. Big talk by Congress of curtailing the high salaries and bonuses of individuals most responsible for the disaster soon dissipated without further action or follow-through. After all, it's Christmas time. The fines that regulatory agencies ultimately levied on the banks were mostly covered by insurance policies, so shareholders bore the cost, rather than the managers for the infraction. So this is like cost shifting. There was no attempt by the U.S. government to use the $700 billion in TARP loans or the bailout of Citigroup to change the lending policies of Citi or other U.S. banks. There was no demand that the banks scale back their dividend payouts to stockholders or interest to bondholders or payments to counterparties on bets gone bad. The Democratic leadership sought merely to save the banks by extending them trillions of dollars of Federal Reserve credit and subsidies unconditionally. The only parties obligated to pay in full without subsidy were indebted homeowners who remained on the hook even for liar's loans, widely recognized as being rife with fraud. So, next section, revising TARP's terms to give easier funding to Wall Street. On October 14th, 2008, let's see, what day was that? It's nearly the day I got fired. Barely 2 weeks into TARP, Paulson made full use of the legislation's leeway, giving the Treasury Secretary broad authority to buy any other financial instrument that he deems necessary to promote financial market stability. Instead of buying mortgage-related securities, the program's troubled assets, the Treasury helped recapitalize bank balance sheets directly by buying $25 billion senior preferred non-voting stock and warrants from each of the 10 largest American banks. The label preferred confuses many casual readers. Bailing out the banks by buying preferred shares instead of directly taking over the most reckless lenders set the Treasury and Fed at odds with the FDIC's ability to protect depositors. An FDIC takeover would have wiped out the value of the government's preferred stock along with that of common stockholders. Although preferred stockholders are paid dividends before normal stockholders get their turn, they do not have legal priority over bondholders or even over speculators in collateralized swaps, the CDOs. In case of bankruptcy, to preserve the government's investment position in bank preferred stock, Paulson's ploy hooked it into continuing support rather than letting the FDIC do its damn job. The non-voting character of the TARP shares prevented the Treasury from exerting management policy over these banks that received funding. It also did not use its controlling creditor position to ask for seats on the bank boards or for any voice in what the banks did with the TARP money or with their deposits and credit creating power. To cap matters, the modified TARP's capital purchase program provided banks with money at a concessionary rate of only 5%. As noted above, government loans are not supposed to be made to insolvent institutions or on easy terms that enable banks to use the funds for speculation in a period of economic stress. But this is precisely what happened. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the first $274 billion of securities purchased represented so large a premium over actual market valuation that it amounted to a 26%, that is $64 billion subsidy to the banks receiving funds. They were rewarded rather than punished for their reckless and even fraudulent lending. This was the opposite of a penalty. It was a reward. It enriched banks for their irresponsibly loose lending, liar's loans, and other financial junk. Warren Buffett, by contrast, obtained a 10% dividend plus stock options for his loan to Goldman Sachs, recalling, of course, that Warren Buffett was, sort of Obama's buddy. A double standard was at work. Chris Dodd, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, accused the Treasury of, quote, an ad hoc and arbitrary, unquote, use of the funds by buying stakes in banks, while the government's purchase of distressed mortgage securities, the plan's original centerpiece, was abandoned. He joined Barney Frank in charging that the Treasury was not following the clear congressional intent of the TARP law, warning that Congress would not release the remaining $350 billion of its $700 billion allocation until, at the very least, the Treasury agreed to use some of the funds to halt foreclosures. The threat, of course, had no effect and seems to have been made mainly to assuage voter anger at the bailout. And yes, there was. Once Obama took office, no more such complaints were heard from the Democrats in Congress or from the government's financial agencies, newly restaffed by pro-Wall Street non-regulators. Next section. Focusing $250 billion in TARP money on one rogue bank, Citigroup. Even the worst-run banks held enough good assets to cover what they owed their insured depositors. So the problem was not whether to save everyday vanilla account holders and customers. It was whether to use public funds to pay the high-stakes gamblers, the non-bank affiliates that had been merged into Wall Street conglomerate holding companies and brokerage houses. And unless you think that that's unimportant, the whole idea of trusts and holding companies and all kinds of other things are part of the problem of how the economy is structured. The negative net worth threatened mainly their bondholders in the web of intra-bank bets on which way interest rates, currency exchange rates, and packaged bank loans would move. Bear Stearns should have been left to fail, Sheila Bair explained in the interview she gave upon stepping down as head of the FDIC in July 2011 because it wasn't, and never was, a retail bank. This is why Bear Stearns didn't have an FDIC or a Federal Reserve safety net. It was only a second-tier investment bank. Such institutions take higher risk, and they're supposed to be outside the safety net. If they make enough mistakes, they're supposed to fail. The bailout didn't have to be give way to the wealthiest speculators, Bear explained. The FDIC had successfully wound down IndyMac, WAMU, and other Washington Mutual, WAMU, and other high flyers in the junk mortgage racket. That was the FDIC's task, after all. But Bear was not allowed to take on the big boys. As Joe Nocera noted in the report on his interview with her, quote, the FDIC had a wealth of experience, in part because it operated IndyMac for 9 months until a buyer was found. It used that time to work on mortgage modifications with IndyMac buyers and came up with a template for a program it felt it could work nationwide. In principle, speculative risk-taking subsidiaries of bank holding companies could have been isolated from the retail banking institutions, much as Glass-Steagall had organized back in 1933. The overall companies could have gone through normal bankruptcy to be settled over the usual tedious process that insolvent corporations had to go through. Bear saw her opportunity when the president vented his frustration over the AIG bonuses. This doesn't happen with our process, she told the president, President Obama. We have a resolution process that we've used for decades. And when we put a bank into receivership, we have the right to break all contracts. We can fire people, we can take away bonuses, and we don't get into this kind of problem. But Bear's arguments lost out to those of Larry Summers and Geithner, and Larry Summers is still around. Oh, God. What decided matters was the fact that one bank needed vastly more money than any other, Citigroup, whose alumni dominated the Democratic Party and its Treasury appointees. On December 12, 2014, Senator Elizabeth Warren summed up that Citigroup's total regulatory capture of the Treasury and other key financial agencies. Quote, starting with former Citigroup CEO Robert Rubin, 3 of the last 4 Treasury secretaries under Democratic presidents, Rubin, Larry Summers, and Jack Lew, have had close Citigroup ties. The 4th, Tim Geithner, was offered the CEO position at Citigroup, but turned it down, unquote. President Obama also appointed from Citigroup the Federal Reserve's vice chairman, Stanley Fischer, the U.S. trade representative, and his deputy at Treasury, Nathan Sheets, and Marissa Lago, responsible for much of the collapse as global head of compliance at Citigroup during 2003 to 2008. These links to what Bill Black has called a criminogenic institution should serve as fatal resume blots. Instead, they evidently qualified such officials for the highest positions, where they set to work to dismantle Dodd-Frank regulations and to continue the support and subsidies for Citigroup, much as the Republican Treasury had supported Goldman Sachs. Rubin protege Geithner had cultivated close ties to Citigroup. Its CEO, Sandy Weil, had offered Geithner the job of CEO after Charles Prince resigned in November 2007. Instead of functioning as the tough cop on the beat in regulating Citigroup, Geithner hobnobbed, holding 29 breakfasts, lunches, dinners, and other meetings with Citigroup executives, report Pam and Russ Martin. Rumor had it that Geithner was prepared to move up from his $400,000 a year salary at the New York Fed, but then was asked to become Treasury Secretary in the incoming Obama administration to use his influence to protect Citigroup and its fellow Wall Street institutions as the crisis unfolded. Bear describes how Rubin's protege Geithner unduly lobbied to defend it by using that familiar saw. If we didn't support Citigroup, it could destabilize the system. As Bear summarized the pressure from Geithner and Paulson this way, they would bring me in after they'd made their decision on what needed to be done, and without giving me any information, they would say, you have to do this or the system will go down. If I heard that once, I heard it 1,000 times. Citi is systemic. You have to do this. No analysis, no meaningful discussion. It was very frustrating. The bank had long been notorious for stretching the envelope, most of all when it merged with Travelers Insurance in 1998. Travelers had bought the brokerage firm Salomon Brothers the year before, so the merger created a conglomerate that was illegal under Glass-Steagall, the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated retail deposit banking from investment banking. That acquisition made Glass-Steagall's nullification an urgent objective for Citibank. The Travelers merger created fierce pressure to revoke the signature 1933 Act of Franklin Roosevelt, FDR. Free market lobbyists pressured the Clinton administration to abolish the law Citigroup had blatantly already violated. Rubin and Summers at Treasury led the deregulatory charge, with Alan Greenspan cheerleading at the Federal Reserve. In November 1999, Texas Republican Senator Phil Gramm, Iowa Republican Congressman Jim Leach, and Virginia Republican Congressman Tom Bliley sponsored the Federal Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999. It was an Orwellian euphemism to characterize disabling the New Deal, FDR's New Deal, as modernization. In the wake of the 1929 to 31 financial crisis, the idea of modernizing finance was to insulate retail consumer banking from Wall Street speculation. It took only a decade for the deregulation of mortgage credit and commercial lending to become tangled in a web of interbank speculation in casino derivatives. Citigroup became the most reckless banking conglomerate, making the worst financial bets. Backed and applauded at the highest levels of government, the deregulatory environment created by reversing the array of New Deal controls proved the genesis of the 2008 crisis. Robert Rubin shepherded Wall Street's lobbying effort to deregulate banking and turn the financial system into a free-for-all to repeat the experience of the vast S&L frauds of the 1980s. History repeats itself. Having used his post at Treasury to help legalize Citigroup's 1999 merger with Travelers, Rubin joined Citigroup to exploit the new deregulated freedom, turning the bank into a Democratic Party version of Charles Keating's Lincoln S&L. But whereas Keating was jailed, Rubin's Citigroup alumni were handed the reins of government, control of the Fed, and exemption from prosecution for the mess they created at vast personal financial benefit to themselves. At Citigroup, CEO Rubin enjoyed the usual enormous salary boost that the Japanese call descent from heaven, over $10 million annually, using the conglomerate's deposits and borrowed funds to gamble on mortgage-backed securities, MBS, and collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. He lost heavily, but kept raising Citigroup's bets, evidently hoping to cover his losses by making a killing somewhere else at somebody else's expense. This financial gaming dragged the bank's retail operations under, and matters got worse after 2007, when Rubin had handpicked Vikram Pandit, a hedge fund manager from Morgan Stanley, to become the new CEO. The selection of Pandit, Baer wrote, simply reaffirmed that Citi was no longer a bread and butter commercial bank. It had been hijacked by an investment banking culture that made profit through high stakes betting on the direction of the markets, in contrast to traditional banking, which focused on making loans to people based on their ability to repay. How quaint. As Citi's position worsened in 2008, Baer wanted the FDIC to at least consider the feasibility of putting Citibank, that is Citigroup's insured national bank subsidiary, through our bankruptcy-like receivership process. That would have enabled us to create a good bank, bad bank structure, leaving the bad assets in the bad bank with losses absorbed by shareholders and unsecured creditors. The FDIC agreed to guarantee Citicorp's issuance of new debt, providing that it was used for lending to help stimulate the economy. But the FDIC examiners discovered that Citi was using the program to pay dividends to preferred shareholders, to support its securities dealer operations, and through accounting tricks to make it look as if funds raised through TLGP, that is the Temporary Liquidity Guarantee Program debt, were actually raising capital for Citi's insured bank. So this is a more sleight of hand. Paulson and Geithner were worried that singling out Citi for special aid would cause a loss of faith in Wall Street as a whole, deeming the bank systemically important, meaning that it owed so much to other institutions on swaps and financial gambles that these counterparties would lose heavily if Citi went under. They warned panic would spread if depositors in correspondent banks recognized how its managers had created a largely empty shell in that many ways resembled AIG's financial house of cards. To cloak an emergency $25 billion loan to Citigroup, Paulson called the 9 leading Wall Street bankers together and informed them that each of their banks would have to accept a $25 billion loan from the Treasury, whether they liked it or not, as part of the capital purchase program announced on October 14th. This scheme was designed to make Citigroup's subsidy appear to be part of saving the system, by which they meant saving the deregulatory philosophy of Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers. Citigroup received hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout funding. Converting the Treasury's $25 billion loan into preferred stock alleviated its over-leveraged debt-equity ratio. The Treasury also extended the bank another $45 billion credit limit and gave it a guarantee for $300 billion in troubled assets, mainly junk mortgages whose market price had fallen by 60 to 80%. These actions saved the bank and its bondholders, but Citigroup's stock plunged below $1 in March 2009, as its equity value fell by more than 90% to just $20 billion compared to $244 billion in 2006. Now, this was $5 billion less than the Treasury's TARP loan. The government had advanced more than the entire market value of the nation's most reckless and formerly largest bank. It is a sign of that bank's success in regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is a common theme for in regulatory parlance, where you have people from the corporations get onto the government regulatory stuff, and fossil fuel is very, very famous for doing that. It is a sign of that bank's success in regulatory capture that public officials were able to resist taking control and running it in the public interest, or even changing its management, not to speak of making its counterparties and bondholders take a haircut for having enabled the bank's disastrous Rubinomics policy. Paulson's TARP, T-A-R-P, plus the Treasury's decision to value Citigroup's assets at fictitiously high levels saved the bank's stockholders from being wiped out, setting the stage for its stock to more than quadruple from under $1 in early March to over $4 a share. It reverse split 1 to 10 in May 2011, so its 2014 to 15 value of $49 a share represents $4.90 in former terms. This is, splits alter the total volume of wealth being created. Troubled Bank of America also made enormous gains after being rescued from FDIC takeover, which have been the real rescue. Next section, the Fed backs the Treasury's bailout much more heavily. Stonewalling requests from Congress to find out details about what junk mortgages and other toxic waste the Federal Reserve was accepting in exchange for its swaps. Chairman Bernanke claimed that the politicians had no right to know how the public purse was being put at risk. Bloomberg filed a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request, and nearly 3 years later, in July 2011, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, provided Senator Bernie Sanders with a report detailing $16 trillion of Fed loans and swaps. It revealed how the officers of Wall Street's leading banks who sat on the New York Federal Reserve Board gave their own firms the fortune of a century to tide them over. As widely rumored, Citigroup, Bank of America, and the insurance conglomerate AIG were prominent among the financial institutions that turned over $2 trillion worth of toxic mortgage packages and illiquid junk bonds to the Fed in order to avoid having to take a loss in the open market, where demand for such packages had dried up once the widespread corruption was recognized. Taking the money and running, bankers emptied out the proceeds of government loans by paying bondholders, large depositors, and counterparties in full. They even continued to pay dividends to stockholders. Wall Street barely missed a beat with their bonuses, Bear noted. Bank-friendly writers and lobbyists, the business journalism press, whatever, the business press, fostered a myth that the economy needed its investment banks to remain solvent to keep the economy functioning, the greater good, But many former officials, including Bear, SIGTARP's Neil Borofsky, and Reagan administration budget director David Stockman, rejected the claims that, David Stockman suddenly becomes a good guy, which is a whole nother story. Rejected the claims that public guarantees for reckless bank loans was needed to protect insured depositors. Retail savings and checking accounts were never threatened by the bad gambles that banks made. But this myth had to be promoted in order for Paulson, Geithner, Bernanke, and other bank protectors to persuade Congress to overrule Baer of the FDIC and make government taxpayers pay. Their aim was to save the banks from being nationalized and to protect bankers from being prosecuted for fraud or reining in the exorbitant salaries and bonuses that they'd given themselves. No attempt was made to change the system that had led to the crash. If the traditional bank reforms had been preserved, then the FDIC would have closed down Citigroup and the government would have regulated the derivatives market. What a concept. If the legal system had worked, chief executives of Wall Street's major investment banks and the crooked brokerage companies that promoted and sold liars' loans would have landed in jail. Instead, banks paid civil fees, often covered by insurance policies, without their executives being prosecuted. Instead of saving the system, the financial oligarchy made its move to end economic democracy. It saved its own future, but not the existing status quo. In addition to Citigroup, the vast pyramid based on debt leveraged bets on financial securities was rescued. To resume paying out salaries and bonuses each year, banks had to repay their TARP loans. And they did this by borrowing from the Federal Reserve, which provided credit without the restrictions that TARP credit had entailed. Over and above the TARP's $700 billion, the Fed extended $2 trillion in cash for trash swaps, which expanded to $4 trillion under the quantitative easing program through 2014. Bailouts, next section, bailouts as a substitute for financial reform. They're just not the same thing. The government could have created money to write down negative homeowner equity, as it had done with the banks. It could have bought bad mortgages at market prices and written down the debts more realistically in keeping with the going rental value. Instead, the Treasury, Federal Reserve, and Congress left the debts in place. They remained a barrier to hopes for upward mobility, which had already been stifled since the 1980s. This is why things are so expensive in places like San Francisco, Boston, New York, etc. Wealth became more concentrated at the top of the pyramid as the economy at large limped along after 2008. This polarization is one of the distinguishing features of rentier and financial wealth as compared to industrial wealth. Under the pretense of restoring normalcy, the new financial oligarchy achieved a political coup to ensure payments of debts owed mainly to the banks, bondholders, and the 1% behind them. Most people hardly realize that Congress, the Treasury, and Federal Reserve had joined to endow bankers, bondholders, and speculators with massive fortunes. The closest parallel is Alexander Hamilton's commitment to pay off the Continentals. This is the paper money that American colonies fighting for their independence had used to pay militiamen and suppliers. The currency had lost nearly all its value, but was bought up by speculators, the vulture funds of their day. Treasury Secretary Hamilton paid them off in full, ostensibly to show the fiscal dependability of the new U.S. government. Speculators used their gains to buy up land in a follow-up series of frauds. This is the move westward. Many of the nation's early fortunes were thus created at the stroke of a pen. The process was repeated in 2008. It was applauded most loudly by the coterie of pro-financial economists calling themselves the Hamilton Project, featuring leading Obama administration figures Geithner, Summers, Rubin, Peter Orszag, and also Roger Altman. Enriching a financial class rife with fraud and corrupt insider dealings inspired a long-standing mistrust of bankers and speculators at America's birth. The resentment inspired Andrew Jackson to close down the Bank of the United States in 1829 and to this is the second American national bank, and to block creation of a real central bank for almost a century. But when the 2008 bailouts took bad debts onto the national balance sheet, the public accepted the giveaway, reluctantly, but under the false impression that there was little alternative. For the Treasury, Federal Reserve, and much of Congress, Wall Street is the economy. It isn't, but at one level it is. At least It is the sector from where financial officials are drawn and from which politicians derive their greatest campaign contribution. Still is to this day. This makes it easy to believe that giving banks special tax breaks and privileges to earn their way out of debt is synonymous with saving the economy. And that whole monkey business has been there for the last decade. The reality is that bailouts are being done at the expense of business, consumers, and industry. The bailout was premised on the illusion that the financial problem was one of temporary illiquidity, not insolvency and the need for deep financial restructuring. Assuming that it's only a liquidity problem, the infusion of money into the banks, their bondholders, and uninsured depositors was supposed to enable the banking system to start lending again, reinflating housing prices and presumably the economy. But there was almost no chance of this really happening because the legacy of bad loans left banks with little ability or even desire to undertake the new lending. So Washington's excuse for the TARP and the subsequent Treasury and Federal Reserve bailouts was based on deception. Banks did not start lending again to reinflate real estate prices because the market already was fully loaned up. Lending also dried up to the small and medium-sized companies that were responsible for most growth and job creation over the preceding decade, similar to this day. In the consumer market, banks scaled back their credit card exposure as well as other consumer loans and business loans after 2008. Refusal to admit the problem of insolvency and how debt deflation would aggravate bankruptcy and unemployment was a key factor for giving the banks the enormous subsidies they received since 2008, saving the claims of bondholders and large depositors on the economy. Erroneous economics thus proved highly purposeful and self-interested. Reviewing Geithner's fanciful memoir, The 2014 Stress Test, Paul Krugman pointed out the Obama administration never really tried to push the envelope on either fiscal policy or debt relief. Wimps. And Geithner's influence was probably an important reason for this caution. He believed that restoring the confidence by saving the banks was enough. And that this is all a PR campaign, that once financial stability was back, the rest of the economy would take care of itself. And he was very wrong. Geithner was wrong because Paul Krugman continued, unlike a financial panic, a balance sheet recession can't be cured simply by restoring confidence. See, this is that PR part. No matter how confident they may be feeling, debtors can't spend more if their creditors insist they cut back. This is the austerity question. But Geithner never mentions the almost equally classic analysis of debt deflation by, our friend, the failure, American economist Irving Fisher. All he did was give the banks what they wanted, using confidence as a kind of rhetorical incantation. This is voodoo economics, as if it were a force in itself. Keeping the pre-2008 buildup of debt in place suffocated the recovery. To make matters worse, the post-2008 debt deflation was reinforced by the Obama administration's fiscal deflation. It tried to pay for the bailout's cost by cutting Social Security, health care, and other programs, including federal revenue sharing with the state and cities. Adding insult to injury, Wall Street's defenders adopted a blame the victim strategy. It was as if poor blacks and Hispanics, the targets most prone to be stuck with predatory liar's loans at exploding interest rates, were cheating Wall Street sharpies rather than the other way around. Reckless borrowers were blamed, not reckless lenders, except for Fannie and Freddie, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, for trying to promote a rise in home ownership to those who evidently could still not afford it. The bailouts endowed a financial class that is evolving into an aristocracy, locking in its gains by shifting taxes off its wealth to push the U.S. and global economy into chronic austerity. This policy can only be defended by deception. Popular opinion in 2008 opposed subjecting 10 million American homeowners to foreclosure. They did not cause the crisis, after all. Banks did. No politician could have won re-election by coming right out and promising public giveaways for Wall Street and labor market flexibility, that is, breaking union power, reducing wages, and scaling back pensions. Meaningful democracy by informed voters had to be subverted. Using the 2008 financial crisis as their opportunity, financial elites set out, everybody got their cut, set out to reverse the social democratic philosophy that had guided fiscal and monetary policy since 1945. Still is doing it. It is, it was in a good shape at the end of the post-war period. I mean, at the beginning of the post-war period, but then it got, subverted by capitalist stuff. Anyway, that's chapter 14. Let me read this little appreciation, I think, of by Slavoj Žižek on the death of Frederick Jameson, because I think this is actually kind of well written. Larger than life, a note on the death of Frederick Jameson. Frederick Jameson was not just an intellectual giant, the last true genius in contemporary thought. He was the ultimate Western Marxist, fearlessly reaching across the opposites which define our ideological space, a Eurocentrist whose work found a great echo in Japan and China, a communist who loved Hollywood, especially Hitchcock, and detective novels, especially Chandler, a music lover immersed in Wagner, Bruckner, and pop music. There is absolutely no trace of cancel culture with its stiff, fake moralism in his work and life. One can argue that he was the last Renaissance figure. What Jameson fought throughout his long life is the lack of what he called cognitive mapping, the inability to locate our experience within a meaningful whole. The instincts that directed him in this fight were always right. For example, in a nice stab against the fashionable cultural studies rejection of binary logic, Jameson calls for a generalized celebration of the binary opposition. For him, the rejection of sexual binary goes hand in hand with the rejection of class binary. Still in a deep shock, I can only offer here some passing observations which provide a clear taste of his orientation. Today, Marxists, as a rule, reject any form of immediacy as a fetish which obfuscates its social mediation. However, in his masterpiece on Adorno, Jameson deploys how a dialectical analysis includes his own point of suspension in the midst of a complex analysis of mediations. Adorno, all of a sudden, makes a vulgar gesture of reductionism, interrupting a flow of dialectical finesse with a simple point like, ultimately, it's about class struggle. This is how class struggle functions within a social totality. It is not its deeper ground, its profound structuring principle which mediates all its moments, but something more superficial, the point of failure of the endless complex analysis, a gesture of jumping ahead to a conclusion when in an act of despair, we raise our hands and say, but after all, this is all about class struggle. What one should bear in mind here is that this failure of analysis is imminent to reality itself. It is how society itself totalizes itself through its constitutive antagonism. In other words, class struggle is a fast pseudo-totalization when totalization proper fails. It is a desperate attempt to use the antagonism itself as the principle of totalization. It is also fashionable for today's leftists to reject conspiracy theories as a fake simplified solutions. However, years ago, Jameson perspicuously noted that in today's global capitalism, things happen which cannot be explained by some reference to some anonymous logic of the capital. For example, now we know that the financial meltdown of 2008 we just are talking about was the result of a well-planned conspiracy of some financial circles. See, it's all there. The true task of social analysis is to explain how contemporary capitalism opened up the space for such conspiratorial interventions. Another Jameson's insight, which runs against today's predominant post-colonial trend, concerns his rejection of the notion of alternative modernities, i.e., the claim that our Western liberal capitalist modernity is just one of the paths to modernization, and that other paths are possible which could avoid the deadlocks and antagonism of our modernity. Once we realize that modernity is ultimately a code name for capitalism, it's easy to see that such historicist relativization of our modernity is sustained by the ideological dream of a capitalism which would avoid its constitutive antagonisms. How then can the ideologues of modernity in its current sense manage to distinguish their product, that is the information revolution and globalized free market modernity, from the detestable older kind, without getting themselves involved in asking the kinds of serious political and economic systemic questions that the concept of a post-modernity makes unavoidable? The answer is simple. We talk about alternate or alternative modernities. Everyone knows the formula by now. This means that there can be a modernity for everybody, which is different from the standard or hegemonic Anglo-Saxon model. Whatever you dislike about the latter, including the subaltern position it leaves you in, can be effaced by the reassuring and cultural notion that you can fashion your own modernity differently, and so that there can be a Latin American kind, or an Indian kind, or an African kind, and so on. But this is to overlook the other fundamental meaning of modernity, which is that of a worldwide capitalism itself. The significance of this critique reaches far beyond the case of modernity. It concerns the fundamental limitation of the nominalist historicizing, the recourse to multitude. This is Deleuze-Guattari, or Hart and Negri. There is not one modernity with a fixed essence. There are multiple modernities, each of them irreducible to others. It's false not only because it does not recognize the unique fixed essence of modernity, but because multiplication functions as the disavowal of the antagonism that inheres in the notion of modernity. It's as such, the falsity of multiplication resides in the fact that it frees the universal notion of modernity of its antagonism, of the way it is embedded in the capital system, by relegating this aspect to just one of its historical subspecies. One should not forget that the first half of the 20th century already was marked by two big projects which perfectly fit this notion of an alternative modernity: fascism and communism. Was not the basic idea of fascism that of a modernity which provides an alternative to the standard Anglo-Saxon liberal capitalist one, saving the core of capitalist modernity by casting away its contingent Jewish individualist profiteering distortion? And was not the rapid industrialization of the USSR in the late 1920s and 30s also not an attempt at modernization different from the Western capitalist one? What Jameson avoided, like a vampire avoids garlic, was any notion of the enforced deeper unity of different forms of protest. Back in the early 1980s, he provided a subtle description of the deadlock of the dialogue between the Western New Left and the Eastern European dissidents, of the absence of any common language between them. To put it briefly, the East wishes to talk in terms of power and oppression, the West in terms of culture and commodification. There are really no common denominators in this initial struggle for discursive rules. And what we end up with is the inevitable comedy of each side muttering irrelevant replies in its own favorite language. In a similar way, the Swedish detective writer Henning Mankell is a unique artist of the parallax view. That is to say, the two perspectives, that of the affluent Stad in Sweden and that of Maputo in Mozambique, are irretrievably out of sync, so that there is no neutral language enabling us to translate one into the other, even less to posit one as the truth of the other. All one can ultimately do in today's conditions is to remain faithful to this split as such, to record it. Every exclusive focus on the first world topics of late capitalism, alienation, and commodification, of ecological crisis, of the new racisms and intolerances, etc., cannot but appear cynical in the face of the third world raw poverty, hunger, and violence. On the other hand, the attempts to dismiss the first world problems as trivial in comparison with the real third world permanent catastrophes are no less a fake. Focusing on the third world real problems as trivial in comparison with the real third world permanent catastrophes are no less a fake. Focusing on the third world real problems is the ultimate form of escapism, of avoiding to confront the antagonisms of one's own society. The gap that separates the two perspectives is the truth of the situation. As all good Marxists, Jameson was in his analysis of art a strict formalist. He once wrote about Hemingway that his terse style, that is short sentences, almost no adverbs, etc., is not here to represent a certain type of narrative subjectivity, that is the lone, hard-boiled, cynical individual. On the contrary, Hemingway's narrative content, that is stories about bitter, hard individuals, was invented so that Hemingway was able to write a certain type of sentence, which was his primary goal. Along the same lines, in his seminal essay on Raymond Chandler, Jameson describes a typical Chandler's procedure. The writer uses the formula of the detective story, that is, detective's investigation, which brings him into the contact with all strata of life, as a frame, which allows him to fill in the concrete texture with social and psychological aperçus, plastic character portraits, and insights into life tragedies. The properly dialectical paradox not to be missed here is that it would be wrong to say, so why did the writer not drop this very form and just give us pure art? The complaint falls victim to a kind of perspective illusion. It overlooks that if we were to drop the formulaic frame, we would lose the very artistic content that this frame apparently distorts. Another Jameson's unique achievement is his reading of Marx through Lacan. Social antagonisms appear to him as the real of a society. I still recall a shock when at a conference on Lenin that I organized in Essen in 2001, Jameson surprised us all by bringing in Lacan as a reader of Trotsky's dream. On the night of June 25th, 1935, Trotsky in exile dreamt about the dead Lenin, who was questioning him anxiously about his illness. I answered that I already had many consultations and began to tell him about my trip to Berlin. But looking at Lenin, I recalled that he was dead. I immediately tried to drive away from this thought so as to finish the conversation. When I had finished telling him about my therapeutic trip to Berlin in 1926, I wanted to add, this was after your death. But I checked myself and said, after you fell ill. In his interpretation of this dream, Lacan focuses on the obvious link with Freud's dream, in which his father appears to him, a father who doesn't know that he is dead. So what does it mean that Lenin doesn't know he is dead? According to Jameson, there are two radically opposed ways to read Trotsky's dream. According to the first reading, the terrifyingly ridiculous figure of the undead Lenin doesn't know that the immense social experiment he single-handedly brought into being, and which we call Soviet communism, has come to an end. He remains full of energy, although dead, and the vituperation expended on him by the living, that he was the originator of the Stalinist terror, that he was an aggressive personality full of hatred, an authoritarian in love with power and totalitarianism, even worst of all, the rediscoverer of the market in his new economic program, none of those insults managed to confer death, or even a second death upon him. How is it? How can it be that he still thinks he's alive? And what is our own position here, which would be that of Trotsky in the dream, no doubt? What is our own non-knowledge? What is the death from which Lenin shields us? But there's another sense in which Lenin is still alive. He's alive insofar as he embodies what Badiou calls the eternal idea of universal emancipation, the immortal striving for justice that no insults and catastrophes manage to kill. Like me, Jameson was a resolute communist. However, he simultaneously agreed with Lacan, who claimed that justice and equality are founded on envy, the envy of the other, who has what we do not have and who enjoys it. Following Lacan, Jameson totally rejected the predominant optimist view according to which in communism, envy will be left behind as a remainder of capitalist competition to be replaced by solidary collaboration and pleasure in others' pleasures. Dismissing this myth, he emphasizes that in communism, precisely insofar as it will be a more just society, envy and resentment will explode. Jameson's solution is here radical to the point of madness. The only way for communism to survive would be some form of universalized psychoanalytic social services enabling individuals to avoid the self-destructive trap of envy. Another indication of how Jameson understood communism was that he read Kafka's story on Josephine, the singing mouse, as a socio-political utopia, as Kafka's vision of a radically egalitarian communist society, with the singular exception that Kafka, for whom humans are forever marked by superego guilt, was able to imagine a utopian society only among animals. One should resist the temptation to project any kind of tragedy onto Josephine's final disappearance and death. The text makes it clear that after her death, Josephine will happily lose herself in the numberless throngs of the heroes of our people, my emphasis added. In his late, long essay, American Utopia, Jameson shocked even most of his followers when he proposed as the model for a future post-capitalist society, the army, not a revolutionary army, but army in its inner bureaucratic functioning in the times of peace. Jameson takes as his starting point a joke from the Dwight D. Eisenhower period that any American citizen who wants socialized medicine needs only to join the army to get it. Jameson's point is that army could play this role precisely because it's organized in a non-democratic, non-transparent way. Top generals are not elected, etc. With theology, it's the same as with communism. Although Jameson was a staunch materialist, he often used theological notions to throw a new light onto some Marxist notions. For example, he proclaimed predestination the most interesting theological concept for Marxism. Predestination indicates the retroactive causality which characterizes a properly dialectical historical process. Another unexpected link with theology provides Jameson's remark that in a revolutionary process, violence plays a role homologous to that of wealth in the Protestant legitimization of capitalism. Although it has no intrinsic value and consequently should not be fetishized and celebrated for itself, as in the fascist fascination with it, it serves as a sign of the authenticity of our revolutionary endeavor. When the enemy resists and engages us in violent conflict, this means that we effectively touched its raw nerve. Jameson's perhaps most perspicuous interpretation of theology, why would he use perspicuous twice? But anyway, theology occurs in his little-known text, St. Augustine as a Social Democrat, where he argues how St. Augustine's most celebrated achievement, his invention of the psychological depth of personality of the believer, with all the complexity of his inner doubts and despairs, is strictly correlative, or to the other side of, his legitimation of Christianity as state religion, as fully compatible with the obliteration of the last remnants of radical politics from the Christian edifice. The same holds, among others, for the anti-communist renegades from the Cold War era. As a rule, their turn against communism went hand in hand with the turn towards a certain Freudianism, the discovery of psychological complexity of individual lives. Another category introduced by Jameson is the vanishing mediator between the old and the new. Vanishing mediator designates a specific feature in the process of a passage from the old order to a new order. When the old order is disintegrating, unexpected things happen. Not just horrors mentioned by Gramsci, but also bright utopian projects and practices. Once the new order is established, a new narrative arises, and within this new ideological space, mediators disappear from view. Suffice it to take a look at the passage from socialism to capitalism in Eastern Europe. When in the 1980s, people protested against the communist regimes, what the large majority had in mind was not capitalism. They wanted social security, solidarity, a rough kind of justice. They wanted the freedom to live their lives outside of state control, to come together and talk as they pleased. They wanted a life of simple honesty and sincerity, liberated from primitive ideological indoctrination and the prevailing cynical hypocrisy. In short, the vague ideals that led the protesters were, to a large extent, taken from socialist ideology itself. You could even say that for, Václav Havel's work, for example. And as we learned from Freud, what is repressed returns in a distorted form. In Europe, the socialism repressed is the dissident imaginary return in the guise of right populism, the AfD, etc. Many of Jameson's formulations became memes, like his characterization of postmodernism as the cultural logic of late capitalism. Another such meme is his old quip, sometimes wrongly attributed to me, this is Zizek, which holds today more than ever. We're almost over. It is easier for us to imagine a total catastrophe on the earth, which will terminate all life on it, than a real change in capitalist relations, as if, even after a global cataclysm, capitalism will somehow continue. So what if we apply the same logic to Jameson himself? It is easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the death of Jameson. All right. Well, I'll leave you with that. You can look at the little video. You can also look at this other thing, which comes from a page where um, the prompt given to Chat GPT is Frederick Jameson died today. Write a Zizek'ian article in his memory, partially inspired by the attached article. So this little second version here is is grinding using the AI to write the little thing here, which is quite and it's fascinating to read, but nothing we should take seriously. All right, I'm done. You talk. Nobody wants to talk. No? Yes?
I'll talk.
I had a question about,
Oh,
the collapse of the housing market, and if the people, like if Barack Obama really internalized what was happening to people, did he, do you, has he ever said anything? Does he have regrets? Did anybody ever confront him about the way that it was handled and
I don't know.
how?
I truly do not know. And I wonder about it because we have not yet had the big memoir that he was supposed to have published. It's not out. It hasn't occurred, right? There was a big book that he was supposed to be writing, and I would assume that he would have fixed all of the historical problems in that book, but it hasn't been published yet.
Well, maybe he got to that part and he just said, you know what, I think I'm just gonna not say anything.
Perhaps, but I think I assume he's an ethical man, and that he would actually comment on it. He should, if nothing else, to disclaim his connection to people like Larry Summers. It's just he just he's tied up with all the most awful people.
I don't really understand how anybody would enjoy socializing with Larry Summers.
Well, that club
Maybe
thing
because
about Harvard, it is, as Feldo would, it's Harvard. It's a Harvard problem.
hmm,
so I'd like to respond to this.
Okay.
Um, Barack Obama is not an ethical person. I mean, I don't see how you could possibly say he was ethical after what you just read. Uh, it,
Gee,
he he appointed these people. He knew who these people were. He knew their track record. It wasn't like he had to appoint Larry fucking Summers and
indeed,
all of these other grifters
indeed.
who sold the American people down the river so that they could benefit their buddies and themselves, and to perpetuate this economic ideology that is destroying societies around the globe and in fact, destabilizing the climate. Um, I mean, everything you read shows that he was in 100% on this, and that he had no care whatsoever for the average American person who was going to lose their home because of his policies. And the excuse that, oh, they had to do it to save the economy. That was not the only way to save the economy. There were people pointing out different ways to do this
Yes,
where people wouldn't, millions of people would not be forced to lose their homes, and for the banks to get off scot-free, and for no one to be prosecuted.
yes,
These were all choices.
well,
And
and
he was,
besides that, his actions, I believe, led to the ascension of Donald Trump to the presidency very directly, as a
oh,
lot of people
absolutely.
do.
And the
So then,
loss and the loss of 1,000 Democratic seats across the country
Yeah.
at the
Yes.
at the congressional elections 2 years after he was elected the first time. I mean, all of that is on his shoulders, but I hope he's enjoying his $12 million house on Martha's Vineyard because that's what he wanted and that's what he got for screwing this country. He's
So,
not
but
an
he
ethical
is an
person.
intelligent, and I think he's somewhat introspective. So, you can only get so much enjoyment out of your beautiful house and your interesting travels and nice meals and so on. Then it becomes mundane. They say once you attain a certain level, I would imagine it's about $100,000 of income around now, that your enjoyment, your happiness does not increase with more money. So I would think that he has a lot of time to reflect. And I would also wonder if people don't talk to Sasha and Malia and say, your dad did some good stuff, but what about this? You know, or he has to know,
Oh, he knows. I just don't think he lets it bother him.
Yeah.
and he
Well,
still interferes like he did. Uh,
With Bernie
well, like
Sanders. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, this is not a good guy. I'm sorry. He's, I know people want to like him because he's intelligent, he's good looking, he's charismatic, but those are all things that he used to get where he is. And he didn't give a damn about the American people.
No different than Trump. Ah,
Yeah. I mean, except Obama is more refined in that he's not selling $100,000 watches and getting into Bitcoin,
and
cryptocurrency.
he did read the Constitution, unlike Donald Trump.
and he's not selling replicas of his signature on those $100,000 watches.
Did you see his silver coin commercial?
Oh God.
Oh God.
Is this new?
I think it's, yeah, kind of new. It's really creepy. It's like
This is
remember Ron Popeil selling the vegetable chopper?
And it really, really works. Yeah.
Yeah. He's like, I, have, what does he say? It's a symbol of the greatness of America. It's
Oh.
99.99% pure. And he
Mm.
goes on about it. And, so it's got about $30 of silver in it, and it's only $100. And
this is Trump doing this, right?
yeah, he doesn't mention that it's got about $30 worth of silver in it, but
Yeah.
that's what it has. Anyway, but he looks exhausted and really pathetic, hawking this new product. It's just, we should just all be embarrassed that that's what's happening in our politics.
Oh, but
Horrible.
I mean, and people are supporting him even though he's doing this right before the election. I mean, he's doing he's selling this crap and people are just, oh, that's fine. I mean, it's just so obvious this guy is doing this for his own benefit and the benefit of his family, and he couldn't care less about this country.
Yeah, but he's going to save the babies, which, of course, the Democrats are all in on killing babies. So
Especially when they pop
who?
out of the.
Oh yeah, as soon as they come out, that's when you kill them.
Yeah, this one's ugly. Get rid of it.
Get rid of it.
I mean, really, if you thought Democrats were baby killers, that's what it's all about.
Indeed.
Sorry.
Hmm.
Uh, well, I think with respect, I think it's time to cut the feed.